The wind on that hill doesn't just blow, it cuts. I stood there in late October, hands shoved deep into my coat pockets, boots sinking slightly into the soft grass that covers what used to be chaos. The air smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet, metallic and cold, and if I held my breath long enough, I could almost hear it, low, rolling thunder that wasn't thunder at all, but the phantom echo of cannons that fired 160 years ago. Gettysburg does that to you. It refuses to let the past stay buried. I had come to this windswept ridge not as a tourist, not as a casual history lover, but because this ground, this exact patch of Pennsylvania soil, had once belonged to my family, or so I had been told. But when I arrived at the visitor center earlier that morning, when I asked to see the registry, the docent had looked at me with polite confusion and said there was no record of any Ashford family claim to the land surrounding Cemetery Ridge. None at all. I had stood there, stunned, holding a photocopy of a deed my grandmother had kept in a cedar box for decades, and the woman had smiled apologetically and suggested perhaps I was thinking of a different battlefield, a different war, a different family. The dismissal was gentle and practiced, the kind of institutional courtesy that erases you without raising its voice. So I left the center and drove to the hill itself, because I needed to see it with my own eyes and needed to feel the weight of what had been taken. The landscape was beautiful in that brutal, open way that battlefields often are, rolling fields, split-rail fences, and the distant tree lying dark against a gray sky. Hallowed ground, they call it. Sacred. But for me, it was also stolen ground, and the silence that surrounded me felt less like peace and more like accusation. I pulled the tintype photograph from my pocket, the one artifact I had brought with me, and held it up against the wind. The image was faded and sepia-toned, the edges soft with age. It showed a man in a Union coat standing in front of a small farmhouse, his hand resting on a fence post, his expression unreadable. My great-great-grandfather, Elias Ashford, photographed sometime in 1864 on the land his father had purchased in 1857. The back of the tintype in spidery handwriting read, "E. Ashford Cemetery Ridge, our farm, not a military installation, not government property, ours." Yet somewhere between Elias' death in 1891 and the establishment of the national park in 1895, the record had vanished. The deeds, the tax rolls, the surveys, gone. And in their place, a clean, official narrative that erased the Ashford family entirely, as though we had never existed, as though this hill had always belonged to the federal government and the ghosts of soldiers, but never to the people who had lived and farmed and died here long before the first shot was fired. I turned slowly, scanning the ridgeline, trying to imagine where the farmhouse might have stood. There were markers everywhere, bronze plaques, granite monuments, cannons frozen mid-aim, but nothing that bore my family's name. Nothing that acknowledged the lives displaced, the land seized, or the records conveniently lost. The wind picked up and I heard it again, that low, distant rumble like the earth itself was groaning under the weight of what it remembered. Or maybe it was just the highway a mile off, trucks barreling past people who had no idea what this place used to be. But I chose to believe it was the past whispering. I chose to believe that the land remembered, even if the archives did not. The contrast was unbearable. This ground, so carefully preserved, so meticulously honored, and yet the people who had lived here before the war, who had lost everything in its wake, were erased as thoroughly as if they had never drawn breath. I slipped the tintype back into my pocket and pulled out my phone, opening the folder I had been building for months. Scanned letters, census records, a handwritten will, a blurry photograph of a gravestone in a cemetery 3 counties over. I had been gathering pieces, fragments, the kind of evidence that wouldn't hold up in a modern courtroom but told a story nonetheless. And standing there on that chilling, windswept hill, I realized that the fight ahead wasn't just about reclaiming land or correcting a historical record. It was about refusing to be silent. It was about standing on the ground my family had walked and saying out loud that we had been here, that we mattered, that our erasure was not an accident but a choice someone had made, and choices could be challenged. The grass beneath my feet was soft, almost too soft, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. I took one last look at the ridgeline, memorizing the curve of the hills, the placement of the monuments, and the way the light fell across the fields. Then I turned and walked back toward the parking lot, the wind at my back now, pushing me forward. The silence of the landscape had broken something open inside me, and I carried that fracture with me, sharp and deliberate, as I prepared to make them hear what they had tried so hard to bury. The hill still lingered in my mind as I drove back to the bed and breakfast, but by the time I unpacked my bag that evening, something else had surfaced. A memory. Not mine, but one I had inherited, passed down like the tintype photograph, folded into family stories told in kitchens and at funeral receptions. My great-great-grandmother, Miriam Ashford, had been 16 years old in July of 1863, living on that same farm when the battle raged around her. She survived by hiding in the root cellar with her younger brother, and when she emerged 3 days later, the fields were littered with the dead and dying. But it wasn't the carnage that haunted her for the rest of her life. It was what she saw on the fourth night, when the burial crews were still working by torchlight. She claimed, in a letter written to her sister in 1871, that she witnessed soldiers rising from shallow graves, stumbling toward the tree line, their uniforms still blood-stained, their faces pale as moonlight. She described the sound of their footsteps, uneven and dragging, and the way they moved in silence, as though speech had been taken from them along with their lives. The letter still exists. I have a photocopy of it, the ink faded but legible, stored in the same folder as the tintype. Miriam wrote it matter-of-factly, without hysteria, as though she were reporting the weather. She never claimed they were ghosts. She simply said they rose and they walked, and by morning they were gone. But when that letter was discovered in 1923 by a local historian compiling oral histories of the battle, it was immediately dismissed. Not quietly, either. The Historical Society published a rebuttal in the county newspaper, calling Miriam's account a product of trauma-induced hallucination, a young girl's mind fractured by the horrors she had witnessed. They suggested, politely but firmly, that her testimony was unreliable and that her family had likely embellished the story over generations, turning grief into folklore. The phrase they used, the one that appeared in multiple publications over the following decades, was well-meaning but unfounded. As though her memory, her lived experience, could be erased with a few carefully chosen words. What made it worse was that other accounts existed, scattered, fragmentary, but there. A Union chaplain's diary mentioned men wandering the battlefield at night, disoriented, speaking in languages he didn't recognize. A Confederate surgeon's notes described patients who should have been dead walking into field hospitals days after their supposed burial. But those accounts were also dismissed, classified as the confused recollections of exhausted men working under impossible conditions. The institutional response was swift and thorough. By 1930, Miriam's letter had been relegated to a footnote in a footnote, mentioned only as an example of how trauma distorts perception. Her voice, her truth, was buried under layers of expert analysis and official rebuttals, and with it went something else: credibility. The kind that matters when you're trying to prove your family's claim to land, when you're standing in front of a government panel arguing that your ancestors were there, that they own the soil, and that their story is part of the historical record. If Miriam couldn't be trusted to report what she saw, how could any Ashford testimony be trusted? The logic was circular and devastating. I didn't believe in ghosts. I still don't. But I believed Miriam saw something, and I believed the speed with which her account was discredited suggested someone had a reason to silence it. What exactly was suppressed? And why was it so vital, so urgent, to ensure that her voice, and by extension my family's voice, was dismissed as folklore? Those questions sat heavy in my chest as I stared at the photocopy of her letter that night, the handwriting slanted and careful, the paper creased from years of handling. She had been 16. She had survived a battle that killed thousands, and in return, history called her a liar. The consequences of that discredit were not abstract. They were financial, legal, and devastatingly concrete. By 1935, when the federal government was expanding the boundaries of the Gettysburg National Military Park, my family's claim to the land was challenged. The county records, which should have supported our ownership, were incomplete. The deeds my great-grandfather had filed in the 1890s were missing from the archives, and without them, the family had no proof of continuous ownership. The case went to a land commission, and the commission ruled in favor of the government. The Ashford family lost 47 acres, including the hill where I had stood that morning, and the compensation offered was a fraction of the land's value. My great-grandfather, Miriam's son, protested. He hired a lawyer, gathered what documents he could, and argued that the missing deeds were not his fault, that the county had a responsibility to maintain accurate records. But the lawyer was overworked and underpaid, and the legal process dragged on for 2 years before the case was quietly settled. The family received $1,200. The land was absorbed into the park. But that wasn't the end of the story. A decade later, in 1947, a portion of that same land was leased to a private organization called the Descendant Legacy Society, a group dedicated to preserving Civil War history through educational programs and historical reenactments. The lease was nominal, almost symbolic, and the society built a visitor center, a research library, and a museum on the site. They became, over the following decades, one of the most respected Civil War preservation organizations in the country. Their director, a man named Dr. Elias Thorne, was a charismatic historian with a doctorate from Yale and a talent for fundraising. He believed genuinely and deeply that history belonged to everyone, that it should be accessible, polished, and inspiring. He saw the Ascendant Legacy Society as a guardian of the grand narrative, the kind of history that appeared in textbooks and documentaries, the kind that made people feel proud and connected to the past. And to maintain that narrative, certain stories had to be smoothed over. Certain voices had to be quieted. Not out of malice, I think, but out of a belief that the messier truths, the uncomfortable details, would only confuse the public and dilute the power of the story. Dr. Thorne never met my family. He probably never even heard the name Ashford. But his society thrived on the land we lost, and the narrative they built there erased us as completely as the missing deeds had. Their version of Gettysburg was heroic, tragic, and clean. There was no room in it for a 16-year-old girl who saw something she couldn't explain, no space for a family whose claim to the land was inconvenient. The contrast was stark. My family's connection to that ground was humble, personal, and authentic. We had lived there, farmed there, and buried our dead there. The society's connection was polished, institutional, and fabricated, built on a lease that should never have been granted and a narrative that depended on our silence. Yet their version was the one that mattered. Their version was the one that appeared in brochures and guided tour. Ours was folklore. That evening, I made myself a cup of tea in the small kitchenette of the bed and breakfast and sat at the rickety table by the window. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, and outside the streetlights were just beginning to flicker on. I held the cup in both hands, feeling the warmth seep into my palms, and I thought about Miriam, about the letter she wrote, the truth she tried to preserve, and the decades of dismissal that followed. I thought about my great-grandfather losing the land and the case and the compensation he deserved. I thought about Dr. Thorne and his grand narrative and the society that still operated on land that should have been ours. And I made a decision, not in anger, though anger was there, simmering quietly beneath the surface, but in clarity. I would uncover the truth, not for vengeance, not to punish anyone, but to correct the historical record and reclaim my family's rightful place in it. I would find the missing deeds, the suppressed accounts, and the pieces that had been deliberately obscured. I would prove that Miriam's voice mattered, that our story was part of the larger tapestry, even if it didn't fit neatly into the grand narrative. The injustice had been loud, public, and institutional. My response would be quiet, dignified, and relentless. Have you ever felt a story calling to be told, even when no one else would listen? I had, and I was going to answer it. The first step was research, and I approached it the way I approached everything else in my life, methodically, carefully, and without fanfare. I started by acquiring copies of obscure archival maps from the Library of Congress, the kind that showed property lines and landowner names in the mid-1800s. I cross-referenced those maps with military records from the National Archives, looking for discrepancies, for gaps in the official narrative that might reveal where the truth had been buried. I contacted independent historians, scholars who worked outside the major institutions, who had no stake in preserving the polished version of events. I was discreet. I didn't announce my intentions or broadcast my progress. I simply gathered information, piece by piece, building a foundation of evidence that could withstand scrutiny. One of the first artifacts I uncovered was a digitized land grant from 1857, signed by the county clerk, and clearly listing Elias Ashford as the purchaser of 47 acres along Cemetery Ridge. The grant had been misfiled, buried in a collection of unrelated documents from a neighboring county, but it existed. It was proof. I also found an annotated battle map from 1863, drawn by a Union cartographer, that showed the Ashford farmhouse marked clearly in the corner, labeled as a civilian structure used briefly as a field hospital. These were not folklore. These were facts, documented and verifiable, and they painted a picture that contradicted the official narrative. The work was slow and painstaking, and there were moments when I wanted to give up, when the weight of what I was trying to accomplish felt too heavy. But I kept going. I created spreadsheets, timelines, and folders organized by date and source. I noted every discrepancy, every missing document, and every instance where the official record didn't align with the evidence I was finding. The chaos of grief, of loss, of generational injustice was still there, but I was no longer drowning in it. I had control. I had a plan. And with every new piece of evidence, I felt the quiet blade of my resolve sharpen, ready to cut through the layers of denial and institutional arrogance that had kept my family's truth hidden for over a century. The maps and deeds were my receipts, my proof, and they would speak louder than any argument I could make. I just had to get them in front of the right people. By morning, the quiet I'd claimed had settled into purpose. I opened my laptop, pulled up the State Historical Archives website, and drafted a Freedom of Information Act request. The form was simple, deceptively so. I entered my name and my email, and in the records requested field I typed all land survey records, field notes, and correspondence related to the 1863 Caldwell County surveys, particularly parcels identified as lots 14 through 18, Township 3 North, Range 2 West. I attached a cover letter citing the public interest in accurate historical documentation. Then I hit submit. The confirmation page loaded with a standard disclaimer. Responses could take 20 to 60 business days, depending on volume and the complexity of the search. I read it twice, saved a screenshot, and closed the browser. The Ascendant Legacy Society had spent decades building their narrative on the assumption that no one would ever look this closely, that the comfort of consensus would outweigh curiosity. But bureaucracy, for all its slowness, had one virtue they hadn't counted on. It was neutral. It didn't care about prestige or patronage. It cared about procedure. I forwarded the confirmation email to myself as a reminder, then set a calendar alert for day 60. The wait would be long, but I'd spent years in silence. I could afford patience now. What I couldn't afford was to move visibly, not yet. The Society's influence reached into town councils, historical boards, and donor networks. If they knew I was digging, they'd mobilize before I had proof. So I let the request sit in a queue somewhere in the Capitol, a small bureaucratic pebble they wouldn't notice until it turned into an avalanche. The house felt lighter that week. I went back to work, answered emails, and graded midterms. But at night, I kept a folder open on my desk labeled Survey Research, and I began mapping what I already knew: the rough boundaries of the disputed land, the names of surveyors mentioned in the Society's published histories, and the gaps in their citations. I printed a timeline and pinned it to the wall above my desk. 1863 on the left, 2025 on the right. Somewhere in that span, the truth had been buried. Now I was giving it a chance to surface. 61 days later, the email arrived. The subject line read, FOIA Request 2025 HC 1847, documents available for review. I opened it at my kitchen table, the morning light slanting across the screen. The archivist had attached a link to a secure portal and a note. We have located 47 documents responsive to your request. Please review the attached index and download within 30 days. My hand hovered over the trackpad for a moment, then I clicked. The index loaded as a spreadsheet. Survey plats, correspondence between the county clerk and the state land office, field notes from 3 different surveyors, and, unexpectedly, a set of handwritten ledgers from a now-defunct title company. I downloaded everything, sorted the files by date, and opened the oldest one first. It was a scanned image of a surveyor's field book, the pages yellowed and brittle, the ink faded to sepia. The handwriting was cramped, technical, and full of bearings and chains and rods. I squinted at the notes in the margins. Most of it matched the published plats I'd already seen. Lot boundaries, corner markers, witness trees. But on page 12, tucked between 2 entries for adjacent parcels, I found a line that made me sit up straighter. Spring, unmarked, approx. 200 FT. Any of lot 16 in W corner. Water clear, constant flow, noted for future reference. I checked the published survey map the society had cited in their application. No spring, no note. Just a clean, confident boundary line that erased the detail entirely. I cross-referenced the surveyor's name, Caleb Thorne, with the other documents. He'd worked the county for 2 years, then moved west. His notes were meticulous, almost obsessive, the kind of record-keeping that suggested he knew his work might be questioned. I pulled up a modern satellite map and overlaid the historical plot. The spring, if it still existed, would sit just outside the boundary the society claimed. But if Thorne's note was accurate, the original lot might have extended farther than anyone realized. I printed the page, circled the note in red, and added it to the wall. The official histories had been written by people who summarized, who simplified, who trusted the published plats without checking the field notes. But the truth lived in the margins, in the details too small to bother with unless you were looking. And I was looking. The chain of ownership should have been straightforward. I started with the county assessor's online database, typing in the parcel numbers for lots 14 through 18. The current owner was listed as Descendant Legacy Society, acquired in 1998. Before that, a holding company called Piedmont Properties LLC. Before that, another LLC, this one called Riverbend Ventures. I clicked backward through the records, watching the names shift every few years, each transfer marked by a quitclaim deed and a price so low it barely covered the filing fees. I pulled the actual deeds from the county clerk's office, paying $12 per document for certified copies. Then I hired a researcher, a woman named Iris who specialized in corporate records and did freelance work for journalists and legal teams. I sent her the LLC names, the dates, and a budget, $500 for a week of digging. She called me 3 days later. Most of these companies dissolved within a year of the transfers, she said. The registered agents were all at the same address, a law office in the capital that handles shell corporations for privacy-focused clients. Not illegal, but not transparent either. I traced the filings back as far as I could, and in 1962, the land was held by a man named Horace Langford. He sold it to the first LLC for $100. $100 for 5 parcels. Quitclaim deed. No warranties, no title search, just a fast exit. I asked if she could find anything connecting Langford to the society. She paused. Not directly, but Langford's daughter married into the Ashford family. They've been on the society's board since the 50s. I thanked her, paid her invoice, and added a new column to my timeline. Shell transfers, 1962-1998. The pattern was clear. The land had been quietly shuffled through opaque entities, erasing any obvious link between the original owner and the society until it landed in their hands with a clean, defensible title. Or so they thought. Iris's work had cost time and money, billable hours I couldn't write off, databases I couldn't access alone, but it had given me the map I needed. The chain wasn't broken, just buried, and now I knew where to dig next. The deed was in a box I almost missed. The county's archives had recently digitized their pre-1900 records, but the index was incomplete, and some documents existed only as physical copies in the basement storage room. I'd requested access through the clerk's office, signed a waiver, and spent 2 afternoons in a windowless room that smelled like old paper and dust. The boxes were labeled by year and document type, organized just enough to frustrate and just poorly enough to hide things. I found it in box 1871D, tucked between a mortgage release and a probate filing. The deed was handwritten on heavy linen paper, the ink still dark despite the years. The language was formal, almost ceremonial. This deed of sale, executed this 14th day of April, 1871, conveys unto Abigail Thorne, a free woman of color, the parcel known as Lot 16, Township 3 North, Range 2 West, Caldwell County, for the sum of $75 in lawful money, receipt acknowledged. It was signed by the seller, a farmer named Josiah Kern, and witnessed by 2 men whose signatures I didn't recognize. At the bottom, in a different hand, someone had written, recorded May 2, 1871. I read it 3 times, then photographed every inch of the document with my phone. Abigail Thorne, my great-great-grandmother, the name I'd grown up hearing in family stories, the woman who'd bought land when most people who looked like her couldn't, who'd built a house and farmed vegetables and raised children who would raise children who would eventually raise me. The society's application had claimed Lot 16 as part of a consolidated parcel purchased by a white landowner in 1868. But here, in faded ink, was proof they were wrong. I requested a certified copy from the clerk, paid the $15 fee, and waited while the machine hummed and spat out the document on watermarked paper. The clerk stamped it, signed it, and handed it over without comment. I slid it into a folder, walked out into the afternoon light, and sat in my car for 10 minutes, just holding it. This was the artifact the society couldn't explain away. Not a summary, not a secondary source, not a map drawn by someone who wasn't there. A deed. Signed, witnessed, recorded. The kind of document that ends arguments. What's one historical injustice you wish could be righted with a single piece of evidence? Tell me in the comments, because this was mine and I wasn't letting it stay buried. The journal I chose wasn't the most prestigious, but it was the right one. Re-examining the past. A journal of revisionist historical inquiry had a reputation for publishing meticulously researched challenges to established narratives. Their editorial board included scholars who'd built careers on correcting the record, and their peer review process was notoriously rigorous. I'd read their work for years. Now I was going to contribute to it. I started by outlining the paper, a clear thesis, a chronological presentation of evidence and footnotes for every claim. The introduction framed the question, how do institutional narratives erase marginalized land ownership, and what happens when primary sources contradict those narratives? The body walked through the FOIA documents, the surveyor's notes, the chain of ownership, and finally, the deed. I scanned and embedded each artifact, cited every archive, and cross-referenced my findings with published histories to show exactly where they diverged. The writing took 3 weeks. I worked in the evenings after my teaching obligations, drafting and revising until every sentence was defensible. I sent a draft to a colleague in the history department, someone I trusted to read critically. She returned it with 2 pages of notes and 1 sentence underlined. This is airtight. Submit it. So I did. The submission portal asked for a cover letter. I kept it brief. This paper presents newly uncovered evidence that challenges the Ascendant Legacy Society's claims regarding land ownership in Caldwell County. The findings are supported by primary documents, including a previously overlooked deed of sale. I believe this work contributes to the journal's mission of historical accuracy and accountability. I uploaded the manuscript and the appendices and clicked submit. The confirmation email arrived within seconds. The review process would take 8 to 12 weeks. I marked my calendar and returned to the rest of my life. But the paper was out there now, circulating among editors and reviewers, carrying the whispers I'd unearthed into rooms where they could no longer be ignored. The society had built their narrative on the assumption that no one would look closely enough to see the cracks. I'd looked. And now the truth had a voice, footnoted and undeniable, waiting for its turn to speak. The attorney's office was smaller than I'd imagined, a converted Victorian on the edge of downtown, the kind of place where the floorboards creaked and the coffee was always lukewarm. Maria Chen had taken my case pro bono after reading my published paper, but she made one thing clear from the start. This would not be fast, and it would not be easy. We sat across from each other at a scarred oak table, and she laid out the reality of a quiet title action with the kind of calm precision I was learning to mirror. The process would take years, not months. We would need to establish a clear chain of title going back to my great-great-grandmother, prove continuous possession or claim, and demonstrate that the society's deed was either fraudulent or secondary to ours. Every document would be scrutinized. Every witness statement was vetted. Every filing fee paid, and there would be many. She estimated the total cost, even with her donated hours, at somewhere between $15,000 and $30,000 for court fees, expert witnesses, and archival research. I had maybe $4,000 in savings, but Maria didn't flinch when I told her that. She simply said we'd apply for fee waivers and take it one motion at a time. The law, she explained, rewarded patience over passion. It demanded evidence, not emotion. I wanted to storm the gates. The system required me to build a siege, brick by brick, and wait. So I nodded, signed the retainer, and accepted that justice would arrive on its own schedule, not mine. While the legal wheels began their slow turn, I reached out to people I'd met only in footnotes and email signatures. Historians who worked outside the university system, preservationists who'd clashed with the society over other sites, and archivists who'd raised eyebrows at certain acquisitions. I didn't announce a campaign or ask for public support. I simply asked questions, shared findings, and listened. One conversation led to another. A retired librarian in Salem mentioned that the society had once tried to claim her family's letters as community heritage and donate them to their archives without permission. A graduate student in Providence confided that Dr. Thorne had pressured him to soften his thesis on indigenous land claims in the region. A museum curator in Newport admitted she'd always found the society's documentation practices unusually opaque. These were not loud allies. They were careful people who'd learned to distrust institutions that wrapped themselves in legacy and prestige. But they were willing to talk, to share, to compare notes in quiet corners of conferences and over long email threads that never mentioned names in the subject line. We became a network by necessity, not declaration, a web of skepticism held together by shared experience and mutual caution. They didn't promise to stand with me publicly, not yet. But they began to watch, to document, and to prepare. And in a fight against an institution built on silence and selective memory, that invisible support felt like a foundation under my feet. My paper had been published in a small journal, Regional Historical Quarterly, the kind of publication that university libraries subscribed to, but most academics never read. I hadn't expected it to travel far, but academic circles, I learned, were smaller and more interconnected than I'd realized. Within 2 months, my work on the rising soldiers phenomenon and the disputed land claim had been cited in a footnote by a Boston University professor, mentioned in a podcast on New England folklore, and assigned as supplemental reading in a graduate seminar at Brown. The questions started arriving at Dr. Thorne's office, polite, curious inquiries from colleagues who wanted to know more about the society's acquisition history, about the provenance of certain artifacts, and about why this particular claim had never been publicly documented before. The Society's official response was a brief statement on their website, emphasizing their rigorous standards and decades of trusted stewardship. But the pressure was there, steady and growing, like water finding cracks in stone. I understood now why Dr. Thorne had fought so hard to control the narrative. The Society managed an endowment worth millions, funded by donors who valued prestige and historical authority. Any suggestion of impropriety, any hint that the Society's acquisitions might be less than spotless, could trigger audits, withdrawn funding, and board resignations. His career wasn't just built on reputation, it was sustained by it. He wasn't a villain in his own story. He was a man protecting what he believed he'd earned, willing to bend truth to preserve legacy. That didn't excuse what he'd done, but it explained why he wouldn't stop. The first sign of retaliation came in the form of a rejection letter. I'd requested access to the Society's archives to review land transfer records from the 1870s, a routine request I'd made dozens of times before. This time, the response cited scheduling conflicts and preservation concerns, suggesting I reapply in 6 months. Then a colleague I'd known from graduate school mentioned, almost offhand, that someone had told her my work was interesting but speculative, lacking the rigor of peer-reviewed scholarship. The comment had come from one of Dr. Thorne's close associates. Online, in academic forums and Reddit threads about New England history, anonymous accounts began posting critiques of my paper, calling it amateur revisionism and questioning my credentials. The posts were careful, never crossing into outright defamation, but always implying that I was driven by personal grievance rather than scholarly integrity. It was a whisper campaign, designed to undermine my credibility without leaving fingerprints. I took screenshots of everything. I documented each denied archive request, each subtle dismissal, and each attempt to reframe my research as emotional rather than evidential. The obstacles were small, but they added up, a friction designed to exhaust and isolate. Yet they also revealed something important. Dr. Thorne was worried. People confident in their position didn't need to smear their critics. They simply presented better evidence. He had reputation and insinuation. I had receipts. Maria and I met again in early November, this time at a coffee shop 2 towns over, away from anyone who might recognize us. I brought the ledger, my great-great-grandmother's personal journal, the one my mother had kept in a cedar chest for 60 years. It was bound in worn leather, the pages brittle but still legible, filled with her tight, slanted handwriting. Inside were dated entries from 1863 through 1867, detailing her observations of the coastline, her experiments with salt preservation, and most critically, her sketches and notes on the rising soldiers' formation during specific tidal and lunar conditions. She had documented the phenomenon with the precision of a scientist, recording dates, weather patterns, and the exact positioning of the rocks. It was a primary source, contemporary to the period, written by the woman whose land this had been. No secondary interpretation, no institutional filter, just her voice, her evidence, and her claim. Maria suggested we approach the Boston Globe's investigative team, anonymously at first, with a scanned copy and a brief explanatory memo. The story wasn't just about my family. It was about how institutions leveraged prestige to silence inconvenient claims and how historical narratives were shaped by those who controlled access to archives and artifacts. The ledger was the kind of artifact journalists loved, tangible, visual, undeniable. We drafted the email together, attached the scans, and sent it from a temporary account. No names, no demands, just the ledger and a single line. Some stories are written by those who were there. The exposé would either land or it wouldn't. But the controlled narrative Dr. Thorne had built for decades was about to meet something he couldn't dismiss or redirect. Public scrutiny, backed by proof he couldn't erase. The email I sent to the Boston Globe landed on a Thursday. By the following Tuesday, the article was live, on the front page of the Metro section, with a full-page spread inside featuring high-resolution images of my great-great-grandmother's ledger, her sketches of the rock formation, and a timeline comparing her documented observations to the Society's official acquisition records. The headline read, "Ascendant Legacy Society Faces Questions Over Coastal Land Claim." Within hours, the Society's board members began receiving calls from donors, from peer institutions, and from local historians who'd long suspected but never spoken. The exposé didn't accuse outright. It simply asked questions the Society couldn't easily answer. By Wednesday, 3 board members had requested an emergency meeting. By Friday, the request had become a formal motion, signed by 5 of the 9-member board, demanding an internal review of all land acquisitions made under Dr. Thorne's tenure. The unified front the Society had always presented, the polished statements, the synchronized messaging, the institutional certainty, fractured along lines that had probably existed for years but had never been tested. Some board members were longtime allies of Dr. Thorne, men and women who'd built their reputations alongside his and saw the exposé as an attack on the institution itself. But others, particularly the newer members who joined in the past decade, saw something different: a liability, a reputational risk, and a question of integrity they couldn't ignore. The meeting minutes, which I later obtained through a public records request, showed the language they used, words like due diligence, fiduciary responsibility, and transparency. They weren't defending me. They were protecting themselves. But the result was the same. The wall Dr. Thorne had built around the narrative was cracking from the inside. The invitation arrived via email 2 weeks after the article ran, a request, not a summons, but formal enough that I knew it mattered. The board wanted to hear from me directly, in a special session scheduled for the first Monday in December. Dr. Thorne would be present. I had 30 minutes to present my findings and answer questions. Maria advised me to treat it like a deposition, calm, factual, and unshakable. I prepared the way I'd been trained, organized binders with tabbed sections, a printed timeline, copies of every document I'd referenced in my paper, and the original deed my great-great-grandmother had signed in 1861, encased in archival plastic. I also brought the ledger, though I'd already provided scans to the board. There was power, I'd learned, in letting people see the actual artifact, in watching them handle pages that smelled of age and salt air. The boardroom was exactly what I'd expected: dark wood paneling, portraits of founders in gilded frames, and a long table polished to a mirror finish. Dr. Thorne sat at the far end, his expression carefully neutral, but his hands were clasped too tightly, knuckles pale. I took my seat across from the board and began. I didn't apologize for the article. I didn't explain my motives. I simply walked them through the evidence: the deed, the ledger, the correspondence, and the surveyor's notes from 1863 that placed my family's claim 2 years before the Society's purchase. I showed them the sketches my great-great-grandmother had made, matched them to archival photographs of the coastline, and demonstrated that her observations were not only accurate but also scientifically valuable. When Dr. Thorne interrupted to suggest the ledger could be a forgery, I handed the board a notarized letter from a forensic document examiner who'd authenticated the ink, paper, and handwriting at my expense. He tried to bluster. I offered proof. He leaned on reputation. I provided receipts. The contrast wasn't subtle, and I didn't need to point it out. The board could see it for themselves. The vote happened 3 days later, in a closed session I wasn't invited to attend. But the results were delivered by letter, signed by the board chair, a woman named Dr. Patricia Wellman, who'd been one of the 5 members to request the internal review. The board had voted 7-2 to suspend Dr. Thorne pending the outcome of an independent investigation into the Society's acquisition practices. They were also initiating a formal process to acknowledge my family's historical claim to the coastal parcel, pending legal review and title verification. The letter was careful, hedged with disclaimers and procedural language, but the substance was clear. They believed me, or at least they believed the evidence enough to act. For years, I'd been the one asking to be heard, submitting papers, requesting meetings, appealing to authority. Now authority was coming to me, asking how to make this right. The contrast was dizzying. I'd spent so long being dismissed that validation felt almost foreign, like a language I'd studied but never spoken aloud. But it wasn't just about me. The investigation would uncover other claims, other families who'd been quietly erased from the record to make room for the society's preferred version of history. The unseen whispers I'd been chasing, the voices my great-great-grandmother had recorded, the stories Dr. Thorne had tried to bury, were finally being given space, authority, and permanence. The board scheduled a public hearing for January. They wanted my input on how to update the historical markers and how to incorporate my family's narrative into the site's official interpretation. They were, for the first time, treating me as an expert rather than an obstacle. The victory wasn't complete. Legal processes still had to run their course, but the shift was undeniable. The truth I'd been protecting for years was no longer mine alone to carry. By spring, the society had been restructured. Dr. Thorne resigned quietly, his departure framed as a transition to emeritus status in the official statement, though everyone understood what it really meant. Dr. Wellman took over as interim director and invited me to join a newly formed historical accuracy committee tasked with reviewing past acquisitions and updating interpretive materials. I accepted, but only on my terms. I would consult, advise, and contribute research, but I wouldn't join the board or become part of the institution. I'd seen what happened to people who let their work be absorbed by organizations that prioritized legacy over truth. The historical markers were updated in May. The new plaques acknowledged my great-great-grandmother by name, detailed her scientific observations, and included excerpts from her ledger alongside the society's own records. The old narrative, vague references to local legends and community heritage, was replaced with something sharper and more honest, a story of a woman who documented the natural world with precision, whose land had been taken through legal maneuvering she couldn't contest, and whose voice had been recovered by a descendant who refused to let it be forgotten. But I didn't stop there. I launched a digital archive, Voices from the Margins, hosted on a simple WordPress site I built myself over the course of 3 months. It wasn't flashy. It didn't have institutional funding or a university affiliation, but it was mine, and it was open. I uploaded scans of my great-great-grandmother's ledger, transcriptions of her entries, essays contextualizing her work within the broader history of women in science, and links to similar projects by other independent historians. I invited submissions from families who had their own overlooked stories, their own evidence that had been dismissed or ignored. Within 6 months, the site had contributions from 12 different families across New England, each adding another thread to the tapestry of history the institutions had never bothered to weave. The contrast was intentional. The society's archives were controlled, gate-kept, and accessible only to those who could navigate their bureaucracy. My site was open to anyone with an internet connection. The old foundation had been built on exclusivity and selective memory. This new one was built on transparency, access, and the recognition that history belongs to everyone, not just those who can afford to control it. The ocean still sounds the same when I walk the coastline now, but the meaning has shifted. I stand where my great-great-grandmother stood, where she sketched the rising soldiers and documented the tides, and I know that her work is no longer hidden. It's on plaques, in archives, in classrooms, and in the digital record, where it can't be erased or reframed to suit someone else's narrative. The path forward isn't about revenge anymore. It's about expansion, finding other overlooked accounts, other families who have been told their stories don't matter, and other voices that institutions like the society have silenced because they complicate the tidy narratives donors prefer. I've already started corresponding with a woman in Vermont whose great-grandfather, a freed black man, kept detailed journals about land he purchased in 1868 that was later claimed by a historical trust. There's a family in Maine whose indigenous ancestors' testimony about seasonal fishing rights was dismissed as folklore, by a museum that now profits from tour of the same coastline. These are the unseen whispers I'm chasing now. Not ghosts, not myths, but witnesses whose words were buried because they threatened someone's version of the past. I have the tools now, the legal knowledge, the network, the platform, and the credibility that comes from having won once against an institution that thought itself untouchable. Dr. Thorne called my great-great-grandmother's observations legends. The society called them community folklore, but I know what they really are. They're evidence, they're testimony. They're the foundation of a history that's more complicated, more truthful, and more valuable than the one carved into marble and bronze by people who mistook power for permanence. They called them ghosts. I call them witnesses, and I am their voice.